Starting at 172. I liked to look at the carafes which the boys put in the vivon to catch little fish, and which were filled by the river that in turn enclosed them, so that they became at once a container with transparent sides like hardened water, and a content immersed in a larger container of coursing liquid crystal, and evoked the image of coolness more deliciously and vexingly than they would have done on a table laid for dinner, by showing it only in that perpetual alliterative flight between the water without consistency in which my hands could not capture it, and the glass without fluidity in which my palate could not enjoy it. I promised myself I would return there later with some fishing lines. I persuaded them to take out a bit of bread from the provisions for our snacks. I threw it into the vivon in pellets that seemed sufficient to provoke a phenomenon of supersaturation, for the water immediately solidified around them in ovoid clusters of starving tadpoles, which until then it had no doubt been holding in solution, invisible, on the point of beginning to crystallize. Soon the course of the vivon is obstructed by water plants. First they appear singly, like this water lily, for instance, which was allowed so little rest by the current, in the midst of which it was unfortunately placed, that, like a mechanically activated ferry boat, it would approach one bank only to return to the other from which it had come, eternally crossed back and forth again. Pushed towards the bank, its peduncle would unfold, lengthen, flow out, reach the extreme limit of its tension at the edge where the current would pick it up again. Then the green cord would fold up on itself and bring the poor plant back to what may all the more properly be called its point of departure, because it did not stay there a second without starting off from it again in a repetition of the same maneuver. I would find it again, walk after walk, always in the same situation, reminding me of certain neurasthenics, among whose number my grandfather would count my Aunt Leonie, who present year after year the unchanging spectacle of the bizarre habits they believe each time they are about to shake off, and which they retain forever, caught in the machinery of their maladies and their manias. The efforts which they struggle uselessly to abandon them only guarantee the functioning and activate the triggers of their strange, unavoidable, and morose regimes. This water lily was the same, and it was also one of those miserable creatures whose singular torment, repeated indefinitely through eternity, aroused the curiosity of Dante, who would have asked the tormented creature himself to recount its cause and its particularities at greater length, had Virgil, striding on ahead, not forced him to hurry after immediately, as my parents did me. But further on, the current slows down. It crosses an estate to which access was opened to the public by the man who owned it, who had delighted in creating works of aquatic horticulture, turning the little pools formed by the vivon into true flowering gardens of white water lilies. Because the banks were heavily wooded here, the trees' great shadows gave the water a depth that was usually dark green, although sometimes, when we came home on an evening that was calm after a stormy afternoon, I saw that it was a light, raw blue verging on violet, Crescion in appearance and Japanese in style. Here and there on the surface, the flower of a water lily blushed like a strawberry with a scarlet heart, white on its edges. Further on, The more numerous flowers were paler, less smooth, coarser grained, ceased, and grouped up by chance in coils so graceful that one thought one saw, floating adrift as after the melancholy dismantling of some gay party, loosened garlands of moss roses, and another place. One corner seemed reserved for the various common species of a tidy white or pink like dame's rocket, washed clean like porcelain with housewifely care, while a little farther off, others pressed against one another in a true floating flower border suggested garden pansies had come like butterflies to rest their glossy blue-tinged wings on the transparent obliquity of that watery bed, of that celestial bed as well, for it gave the flowers a soil of a color more precious, more affecting than the water lilies in the afternoon in a kaleidoscope of silent, watchful, and mobile contentment, or whether toward the evening it filled, like some distant port, with the rose and reverie of the sunset, ceaselessly changing so as to remain in harmony around the more fixed colors of the corollas themselves, with all that is most profound, most fleeting, most mysterious, all that is infinite. In the hour it seems to have caused them to flower in the middle of the sky itself. As it left this part, Vivonne flowed freely again. How often did I see, and want to imitate, as soon as I should be at liberty to live as I choose, a rower who, having let go of his oars, had lain flat on his back, his head down in the bottom of his boat, and allowed it to drift, seeing only the sky gliding slowly above him, bore on his face a foretaste of happiness and peace. We would sit down among the irises at the edge of the water. One idle cloud would linger in the holiday sky. Now and then, oppressed by boredom, a carp would stand up from the water with an anxious gasp. It was time for our snack. Before starting off again, we would stay there on the grass for a long time, eating fruit, bread, chocolate, and we would hear, coming all the way up to us, horizontal, weakened, but still dense and metallic, the peals of the Saint Hilaire bell, which had not melted into the air they had been transversing on for so long, and which, ribbed by the successive palpitation of all their waves of sound, vibrated as they brushed over the flowers at our feet. Sometimes, at the edge of the water and surrounded by woods, we would come upon what is called a vacation house, isolated and secluded, seeing nothing of the world but the river that bathed its feet. A young woman, whose pensive face and elegant veils did not belong to this region, and who probably had come to bury herself here, as the expression has it, to taste the bitter sweetness of feeling that her name, and more importantly the name of the one whose heart she had not been able to hold fast, were unknown here, stood framed in a window that did not allow her to look farther than the boat moored near the door. She would absently lift her head as she heard, behind the trees along the river bank, the voices of people passing, of whom, even before she glimpsed their faces, she could be certain that they had never known the faithless one, nor ever would know him, that nothing in their past bore his imprint, that nothing in their future would have occasion to receive it. One sensed that, in her enunciations, she had deliberately withdrawn from places where she might at least have glimpsed the man she loved, in favor of these places which had never seen him. And I watched her as she came back from some walk on a path along which she knew he would not pass, drawing from her resigned hands long gloves of a useless grace. Never in our walk along the Guermantes way could we go as far as the sources of the Vivonne, of which I had often thought, and which had in my mind an existence so abstract, so ideal, that I had been as surprised when I was told they could be found within the département, at a certain distance miles from Cambrai, as I was the day I learned there was another precise spot on the earth where the opening lay in ancient times of the entrance to the underworld. Never, either, could we go all the way to the end point that I would so much have liked to reach, all the way to Guermantes. I knew this was where the Castellans, the Duke and Duchess of Guermantes, lived. I knew they were real and presently existing there. But when I thought about them, I pictured them to myself sometimes made of tapestry, like the Comtesse de Guermantes in our church's coronation of Esther, sometimes in changing colors, like Gilbert the Bad in the stained glass window, where he turned from cabbage green to plum blue, depending on whether I was still in front of the holy water or was reaching our seats. Sometimes completely impalpable, like the image of Geneviève de Brabant, ancestor of the Guermantes family, which our magic lantern sent wandering over the curtains of my room or up to the ceiling, but always wrapped in the mystery of Merovingian times, and bathing as though in a sunset in the orange light emanating from that syllable ans. But if despite this they were, as Duke and Duchess, real human beings for me, even if strange ones, on the other hand, their ducal persons was inordinately distended, became immaterial in order to contain itself within this Guermantes, of which they were Duke and Duchess. All this sunlit Guermantes way, the course of the Vivonne, its water lilies and its tall trees, and so many lovely afternoons. And I knew that they did not merely bear the title of Duke and Duchess du Gemont, but that since the 14th century, when, after uselessly trying to defeat its former lords, they had formed an alliance with them through marriages, they were also Comtes du Cambrai, and thus the foremost citizens of Cambrai, and yet the only ones who did not live there. Comtes du Cambrai, possessing Cambrai in the midst of their name, of their person, and no doubt actually having within them that strange and pious sadness that was special to Cambrai, proprietors in the town, but not of a private house, probably dwelling outdoors in the street between sky and earth, like Gilbert de Germont, of whom I could see, in the windows of the apse of St. Hilaire, only the reverse side of Black Lake, if I raised my head as I went to get salt at Camos's. And along the Guermantes way I would sometimes pass damp little enclosures which climbed clusters of dark flowers. I would stop, thinking I was about to acquire some precious idea, because it seemed to me that there before my eyes, I possessed a fragment that was fluvial, of that fluvial region I had so much wanted to know ever since I had seen it described by one of my favorite writers. And it was with this, with its imaginary ground traversed by currents of seething water, that Guermantes, changing its appearance in my mind, was identified when I heard Dr. Persepied talk to us about the flowers and the beautiful spring waters that could be seen in the park of their country house. I dreamed that Madame de Germont had summoned me there, smitten with a sudden fancy for me. All day long she would fish for trout with me. In the evenings, holding me by the hand, as we walked past the little gardens of her vassals, she would show me the flowers that leaned, their violet and red stems along the low walls, and would teach me their names. She would make me tell her the subjects of the poems that I intended to compose. And these dreams warned me that since I wanted to be a writer someday, it was time to find out what it meant to write. But as soon as I asked myself this, trying to find a subject in which I could anchor some infinite philosophical meaning, my mind would stop functioning. I could no longer see anything but empty space before my attentive eyes. I felt that I had no talent, or perhaps a disease of the brain, keeping it from being born. Sometimes I counted on my father to make it all come out. He was so powerful and in such favor with people in office that he had succeeded in having us transgress the laws that Francois had taught me to consider more ineluctable than the laws of life and death. To procure for our house alone, in the whole neighborhood, a year's postponement of the work of replastering, to obtain permission from the minister for Madame Cesaret's son, who wanted to go take to the waters, to pass his baccalaureate 2 months ahead of time in a series of candidates whose name began with A, instead of waiting for the turn of the S's. If I had fallen seriously ill, if I had been captured by bandits, convinced that my father was in too close communication with the supreme powers, had letters of recommendation to the good Lord, too irresistible for my illness or captivity to be anything but empty simulacra that posed no danger to me, I would have waited calmly for the inevitable hour of my return to the correct reality. The hour of my rescue or recovery, perhaps my lack of talent, the black hole that opened in my mind when I looked for the subject of my future writings, was also merely an illusion without substance. This illusion would cease through the intervention of my father, who must have agreed with the government and providence that I would be the foremost writer of the day. But at other times, as my parents grew impatient at the sight of me lingering behind and not following them, my present light, instead of seeming to me an artificial creation of my father's that he could modify as he liked, appeared to me on the contrary to be included in a reality that had not been made for me, against which there was no recourse, within which I had no ally, which concealed nothing beyond itself. At those times it seemed to me that I existed the same way other men did, that I would grow old, that I would die like them, and that among them I was simply one of those who have no aptitude for writing. And so, discouraged, I would give up literature forever, despite the encouragement I had been given by Bloch. This intimate, immediate awareness I had of the worthlessness of my ideas prevailed against all the praise that might be heaped on me, as do a wicked man whose good deeds are universally condemned, the qualms of his conscience. That is page 178.